the chat and so on. All right, Christina, got it. Okay. There. Okay. All right, thanks everyone for coming to the Comprehensive Plan Implementation Committee meeting. Really appreciate it. We have folks from the CPIC from that committee. We also have folks from the Design and Landmarks Committee, the DLC, and from the Tree Board. So thanks very much everyone for coming. Really appreciate it. Just a couple of things. We've got folks that have, I think we've got, looks like everybody's had a chance to rename themselves. So that's terrific. Thank you very much. I just kind of wanted to welcome everyone to the project. Again, this is a project where we're working on code amendments to implement policies from the comprehensive plan and also to make sure that we're in compliance with House Bill 2001 related specifically to middle housing, tree preservation, and off-street parking in residential areas. So we're focusing on the residential areas in the city, and we're going to get into more details in a second, but this is a big project for us, and we'll be going over the timeline and all of those sorts of things in a moment, but this affects all of the folks here, of course, the whole city. We really appreciate your time giving us feedback and helping us frame the discussion as we move forward with creating some code amendments. One thing I just want to ask specifically of the CPIC committee members, we have a full agenda, but I do just want to, and this kind of relates to that, we've had some feedback from some folks. There's a lot to cover. There are a lot of things that folks may have questions about, and you may always reach out to me specifically. I'm happy to set up time to talk to anybody if you have particular questions about what's happening, what we're talking about with the project. But what I'd like to suggest or ask is if the CPIC members would be willing to perhaps increase the time for our meetings. 2 hours is not a lot of time to get through some of these things. We may not need all of the time, but we want to make sure that we have time for the committee members to be able to ask questions throughout the meeting and have a conversation with each other. If we were meeting in live and in person, there'd be time before a meeting for chit chat, after a meeting for chit chat, or being able to ask questions. And in this Zoom environment, it's really difficult to do that. So if you could just think about it, we can circle back at the end of the meeting, but I'd like to suggest that we extend our meetings to 9 o'clock, not meaning that we need to use all the time every time, but that we've got a little extra padding in our schedule to be able to allow for some time during the meeting. And have a little bit more time to answer questions and have a bit more discussion time. So if you think about that, I'd appreciate it. And we can circle back at the end of the meeting and see if people will agree to that. And then we can do that for the next meeting. Not doing it for this meeting, so for the next one, not tonight. So thanks very much. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Marcy McAnally. She's our head of our consulting team through HerbsWorks, and she's going to take it from here, and we'll jump right into this meeting. So, oh, I'm sorry, Elvis, did you have your hand up for a question? No. Okay, great. Okay, so Marcy, take it away.
Vera, do you mind bringing the presentation up?
I am happy to do that.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for your time this evening. I'm Marcy McAnally with HerbsWorks. I'm an architect and urban designer based in Portland, and we're working with the city on this project. And I have a couple of my team members here, Kimmy Sloop, who will be talking to you during the presentation, and also Pauline Rueg from HerbsWorks are here to help. So I'm going to start right in on the presentation because we do have a lot to cover, but we also want to have a good amount of time to work with you on a little exercise. I think it's going to be fun and challenging. And I want to give everyone permission to ask really dumb questions because we're all in this world of zoning codes and things like that. They're pretty complicated. Some of us are experts in one area and some of us are experts in another area, but we actually don't always get to talk to each other. So this is through the course of this project, we're going to have tree experts speaking to non-tree experts and zoning experts speaking to non-zoning experts and experts speaking to experts. So just encourage you to, if it's a detailed question, save it for Vera, but otherwise ask it, and during the interactive workshop, there'll be lots of time for speaking up. So yeah, jumping right in here. Can you go to the next slide, please? I want to just go over some Zoom meeting procedures. So we're in a webinar mode, and there are these tools along the bottom of your screen that will allow you to chat, for example. And also, I think that's the main thing we want you to know how to do. So let's move on. These are all the people who are here. And normally in a CPIC meeting, we would introduce everybody, but that's partly why we've asked you to all name yourselves, so that we actually don't have time to go through the whole group. But thank you, tree board people and Design and Landmarks Committee people, for joining us this time. Maybe you could just go back for a second,
Oh, sorry.
because I skipped over the fact that we have a lot of city staff people here today as well, to help us with the exercise. So you'll see that we have people from Public Works and Urban Forestry, as well as planning, community development. So this is a very interdisciplinary group and meeting tonight. Next. The objectives for this meeting are to get an update on the community engagement and learn about our code audit and some of the high-level technical findings. I'm going to also tell you a little bit about what a form-based code is, because there are some techniques in that zoning approach that we hope to use in this project. And then we'll just be discussing with you, this is part of the interactive workshop, what is a clear and objective standard, and how can you use it to achieve middle housing and tree preservation and things like that. So it's a little esoteric, but I think you'll get into it. And then we'll talk about the next steps in the project, so you all know where we're going next. The committee charge here is, I'm just going to go through this quickly, for the CPIC members to support the city. I'm going to jump down to help facilitate meetings with their neighborhood district associations. This is actually an activity that will be coming up, and we'll be asking you, some of you have already volunteered, and we'll be asking more of you to do so, where we'll be providing you presentation material and coaching so that you can take some of this information out to your own communities. Next. So how we're going to use our time is, I'm going to hand it over to Kimmy in a moment, and she's going to talk about the community engagement results that we've gotten that are very interesting. And then I'm going to go through the technical findings of the code audit, but also talk really big picture about why we are doing a code audit and code amendments at all. Then we'll go into the some setup for the interactive exercise, and we'll move into that. And you'll be going into breakout rooms to do the exercise, so it'll be a much smaller group at that point. And then we'll come back again to have the small group share with the large group, and then we'll take public questions and we'll adjourn. Next. So this is really important. I want to point out where we are now, and a little bit about where we've been and where we're going, so that CPIC members know what's expected, but also so that you, tree board and design focused people, also have a picture of where we're headed and where you're going to be seeing more results as the project proceeds. We are in this phase called concept development. We have wrapped up the code audit and analysis, and the concept development is about identifying how we're going to go about amending the code to meet to implement the vision and the comprehensive plan. The code audit phase was about what you have to do to your code to make it, to fix it, basically. And now we're in the phase of how. We'll be proceeding into sharing that information with the community in a second round. And when we are into next year, you'll see under April that we'll be actually sharing draft amendments with you. You'll have a chance to review exactly how we have settled on updating the zoning code and comments. I think there's a slide that goes into a little bit on here. Maybe you just go to the next slide. I think it's the one that talks about, yeah. So where we have been and where we are, we've finished up tasks 1 to 3 of the work scope. We've conducted stakeholder interviews, held an open house and a survey. We've conducted a code audit and identified issues and the recommendations that we'll take to understanding the code amendments there are choices to be made within the code amendments, and we'll be working with you on those and sharing some of that information with you tonight and trying to explain to you how code amendments are drafted so that you can help us consider all the things that you think are important. One of the most important things that we need to realize at this time in the project is that there are a lot of considerations, and they may not all be able to be regulated in the way that a zoning code implements change. And so I think tonight's meeting will be helpful in setting a frame around the things that a zoning code can do and the things that a zoning code can't do that might have to be part of other projects or other efforts. We're going to share, or we will have at the next meeting the results of a parking survey. There are 4 neighborhoods that we have our parking expert, Rick Williams, actually analyzing the parking supply and the utilization of parking there so that we can make really informed choices about how to use on-street parking and on-site parking. And as you know, parking is a big issue and tends to be very controversial. You want to make sure we have lots of facts. And then also the technical team members. We have an arborist on our team, a parking expert on our team, and a number of natural resource and planning experts. They've been interviewing people from other cities who've implemented zoning codes for middle housing or parking changes, or instituted new tree standards, or set up an urban forestry commission. We've had these people talking to also people within the city to understand exactly some of the issues that city staff experience when they're trying to administer the code the way that it is set up today. And all of this is to make those people's experiences better, including the users and the applicants of the code. So I think I'll just go on to handing it over to Kimmy to talk about the survey results and the.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Vera. So we're a little behind schedule, so I'm going to go through this stuff just kind of at a high level. You do have the summary in your packet, and you also received today, I believe, a memo from the city's community engagement coordinator that helps put the survey in context, because I know there were some people who are concerned about the number of surveys we've received. So we did receive 93 completed surveys and 3 other written comments, and then I understand that there were a few more that came in after it closed. We did have 233 people that clicked on the station, so they looked at the open house and just might not have provided feedback on the surveys. We did do everything as a Spanish version as well, and we didn't have a lot of people participate in that, but we did have 3 people click through it. So it's one of those things where you just got to keep doing it and let people know that it's out there, and then hopefully we'll have more people participate. This was the first event, the first project that has used the Bang the Table platform for the city, and so we had 170 people who registered with Bang the Table in order to participate in the open house and the survey, which is great because literally everyone had to register. In the future, if you do a different open house, a different project, and go into it, you don't have to register. So that makes it, that's great that many people chose to register and look at it for the first time, which is great. As far as some of the demographics go, there were 80 people, 80% of the respondents own their own home, which is kind of interesting since we're talking about who middle housing and people who might be interested in middle housing. And then 89% of the respondents self-identified as Caucasian, and 5% of people of color. Should be noted here too that some people chose to identify themselves in 2 different categories or more. So that's a little lower than for the people of color. That number is a little lower than the overall city demographic. So that's something that we want to work on for the next time, next go around. So I just want to remind people that this is kind of a context of this open house and survey was just one of the many ways that we're going out to getting input from the public. It's just one piece of the puzzle. So just want to keep that in mind. So as far as what we heard that people thought the priorities that benefit the entire Milwaukee community were the most important. So they were hang on a second, I just shut my summary document. But the issues that were most important to people were providing greater equity throughout Milwaukee by increasing housing options, protecting and increasing the tree canopy, and reducing parking requirements in all residential neighborhoods in Milwaukee, and balancing the community needs of more housing, protecting the environment, and reducing the focus on the car, and also affordability. So those are really things that are kind of overarching for the entire city. There was consistency. One of the least important priority was the consistency of middle housing design with the scale and form of existing neighborhoods. It was also identified as a concern for almost half of the folks. So it's kind of that, this is important and I care about it, but I'm not sure how important it is, I guess. People felt more positively than negatively about middle housing, so they're more positive. They identified more positive benefits of it, I guess, than perceptions that would be negative. People did understand the benefit of tree protection. Almost 90% of the folks identified that shading and cooling and environmental benefits was important, which is great because that just makes the messaging easier if people already believe that trees are important to protect. The reducing housing parking requirements, that was the greatest concern for people. It just there were lots of concerns about the ability to park off-site or on the street and such. And then overall, there was a concern about how policy is implemented and kind of when these are the code requirements, if they actually achieve the goals that are desired. Affordability, for example, people are concerned that the housing may not end up being affordable, or that you may that the parking demands won't fit the code requirements, the developers will find exceptions. Those are some of the things that were identified as things people were concerned about. And so having the clear and objective standards that we'll be talking about later will really make a difference. Then go ahead and go to the next slide, please, Vera. What we learned from this is that we have more work to do. We did get 93 responses, which is consistent with like a live open house and is actually pretty good. But we had, we'd like to get more people involved. And as the project gets out there more and people learn more about it, then hopefully we will get more people to respond. We want to understand, one of the things we learned is that as the registering on Bang the Table. So people need to understand why they need to register on Bang the Table. So what we're doing is we're working with the city's communication team to make sure that as a whole, that people understand why it's important to register and participate through Bang the Table. We need greater input from the BIPOC community. We will make sure, our goal will be 12% of responses being from the BIPOC community for the next round of engagement. And we will be meeting with the city's new equity manager in January to talk about that and enhance our outreach efforts. We did do some outreach to the Latinx community, but I think the timing of it just wasn't great. So we will make a more concerted effort to do that for the next round. We did learn that people responded to the personal ask. We had a significant number of people identified that that's how they learned about the survey, was they received a direct email, or a friend forwarded it to them, or a city councilor or someone that they knew asked them directly to participate. And so we're going to take that information, and this next round of public engagement, we will be doing more one-on-one outreach. And that's the whole concept behind the meeting in the box that Marcy mentioned earlier, that they're asking the CPIC members to go out and talk to their groups or talk to different groups and share it amongst yourselves, because it does mean a lot more coming from an individual, having that individual ask, than just reading about it in the pilot, for example. We also think that given the timing of this survey was open November 12th through the 29th, and there was a lot going on in the United States and the state at that time. And so we think some of that might have reduced participation. It was right after the election. In the middle of this, right as we were announcing, releasing the open house, we got put into the COVID freeze. And so, some of our outreach was designed to have more one-on-one outreach, as far as like putting flyers at local businesses and restaurants, and we couldn't do that. So there are things like that that may have impacted it. And then we also had the start of the holidays. So that's just kind of a theory of why maybe we didn't have as much participation as we liked. And bottom line is we can do better, and we will. I mean, we're committed to getting the word out there, and we are just asking for all of your help in doing that. And we'll report in this next round of engagement. We will be looking at this and trying to figure out how to get more people involved. And we'll be reporting back at the next meeting, the next CPIC meeting, about what that approach is more specifically for the next round of engagement. That's the really brief overview. Are there any questions? I haven't been looking at the chat, so let's see. Okay.
I want to acknowledge that there are a couple of questions that have to do, well, there's a question that's been answered about home ownership, and information has been answered. And the question, Nicole, that you asked about affordability, thank you for posing that. We'll make sure that we talk about that at a future meeting. And I would suggest that if people have other questions like that, they want to have an issue covered in more depth, this or talking to Vera is a good way to let us know.
One other thing I want to mention too is that we knew that this was a very complex issue of trying to communicate, well, just the project in general, but communicating housing, parking, and trees. It's complicated, and there was a lot of information in the open house that was presented, and that was a challenge. And what we want to do for the next round is to see how we can simplify that and take it to the next step, and giving ourselves some more time, and we'll have some more reviews and involve more in the CPIC in doing that. Ronell, you had questions?
Does anyone have specific questions about the public outreach?
How many use the comment boxes?
Yeah, I did have a couple of questions.
So your question about the
that's one, yeah, that was one of them, is the raw data out of the comments boxes. A lot of people I know who took the survey, who I asked to take survey, came back and said, I couldn't really answer the questions, especially the first one with the ranking, because of the way things were bundled together, and I didn't really agree, but I had to rank things. And a lot of people have told me that they use the comments boxes on the various questions that had them to put in feedback. And I'm curious about that data.
So in the summary report, we do talk about, we went through the responses for when people identified other and grouped them into categories. So not all of the comments are listed, but they're grouped by categories.
Can we see raw data? I'd be really interested to see raw data. I do a lot of community polling.
And I think that's something that Vera can work with you on.
Okay. So I'll contact her about that. My other question, again, it might be a Vera question, is I was surprised that the number of contacts that were made weren't here. You know, how many people were emailed? What are the numbers on the email list? So that then you can do the math in terms of the responses, because the overall response per our population was only 0.004% for our population of 21,500 people. So it's an extremely low, you know, in terms of being representative of the community in any way, it's extremely low. So I wondered about the numbers of, you know, how many people are on the city's email list, that number of emails were out, because that helps put into context, you know, the responses, and gives a real perspective on the survey that we just can't get without those numbers.
Right. There was at the last CPIC meeting, we presented a memo, which unfortunately I don't have right in front of me, about the outreach that we did do, and everyone in the city.
My question is, were there numbers? I know
that's what I can't.
Yeah, it was at the meeting. Yeah, so that would be a question to ask.
Everyone in the city received the Milwaukee newsletter, so they did.
Yeah, the newsletter. I'm thinking more about the email lists and such.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to
want to
interrupt.
take a lot of time.
Yep, Renelle, I think what I can do is I can go back and I know who everyone we emailed and all those things. I can put those numbers together for you. I just don't want to take up too much time here tonight to do that, but I can put that together for you. No problem.
I'll contact you. Cool.
Yep, please do. No problem. Yep.
Yeah, because I'd like a bigger, the whole picture from the survey.
Sure thing.
And why so many people visited and didn't take it. And I assume there was no exit pop-up saying, how come you didn't take our survey? So we're kind of guessing at why people didn't take the survey instead of really knowing.
A couple things to point out with that, and then Renee, I'll answer your question about how the results will be used. The number of visitors to the site, there were lots of people. Any clicks have people visiting the site, so you could visit the site multiple times if you go in and look at it. It's not unusual for people to attend an open house and not provide feedback. If you think about public events where they were in person, there's a lot of people who come and listen to the presentation and choose not to provide feedback. So it's not that surprising that number was lower. As far as how the results of the survey are being used, what we'll do is take this input, and it helps with our messaging and understanding how we need to communicate things, how we need to explain things better or in more detail, and kind of what people's priorities are, to understand what they think is important moving forward, and how to explain some of the issues. So for example, the issue with the trees, that people think tree preservation is important and they understand the benefit of that. That helps us advance that discussion faster than some of the other conversations. So it's really the general, it's messaging, it's helping us understand. It's not, this information is not necessarily intended to frame the concepts. That's what we'll be working on later today, is the framing of the clear and objective standards, and what that means.
Yeah. I just sometimes have concerns when we're going to draw certain conclusions from data. And the question also is like, well, how good is the data to begin with? Especially on that question number 1, where you were forced to rank things where you might not have wanted some of those things in those bundles at all.
And that's, yeah. And we look
anyway, we'll let it go. I know there's a lot to do. Thank you.
I think we are done with, looks like we're done with questions related to that.
We have one hand up from Celestina.
Oh.
I just wrote it in instead.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we would like to get more feedback from the non-homeowner demographic.
Okay, I'm going to jump into the more for the code amendments piece now. So first of all, the code audit that we provided to the report the report was sent to CPIC members, and it's available. The code audit is one of the first steps to undertake when you're writing code amendments. And the reason we're involved in this whole project is so that we can update the zoning code and other related codes and procedures so that they truly implement the goals of the comprehensive plan and the community vision that the city has been, and the community many of you have been working on for the last 15 years. There are many, if we could just move to the next slide, please. A comprehensive plan is a really important undertaking. Cities only do it, every 10 or more years. And in the case of Milwaukee, it's been even longer. And so the updating a comprehensive plan means updating all of the policies that have to do with natural resources and urban growth, and how you spend your money in the city, and on in what way and where you grow and how you grow, and how your growth is informed by your values. That is all part of a comprehensive plan, and the city has undertaken that effort and produced I think what is a really amazing document as a sort of a point in time of where Milwaukee stands. This document, the comprehensive plan, now guides your growth for the next 10 to 20 years. So it's really important, but there are a lot of things in your zoning code that actually work at odds to, they contradict these goals, or they simply are silent, or they don't help. So our goal in this project is to update the community development so that it is in alignment with and furthers the comprehensive plan goals. Specifically, some of the goals in your comprehensive plan and vision that need to be better expressed through the rules, the regulations for development, have to do with increasing community diversity, preparing for population growth, protecting natural resources, and improving the city's climate resiliency. And on the left, you'll see I think this is a series of lenses that Milwaukeeans have been using to kind of evaluate the values through the comprehensive plan project, and they would apply to this project as well. Next. This project is really important. Every city in Oregon now is going through the project of updating their single dwelling zones or single family zones. And I want to talk about how unusual this is. Since the end of the last century, about mid-century after World War II, we started to put into place single family zoning, and the federal government actually paid out loans and subsidized home mortgages based on a goal for increasing single family housing. And the zoning that exists today in the form of R5, R7, R10 in your city is the result of that decades and decades of policy and lending practices and financing practices. And what we're proposing to do through the code amendments is specifically amend the zoning code that applies to this area. And that hasn't been done for probably 50 to 70 years. Maybe some incremental things changes have been made or applied to very limited areas, but this will actually change all of these areas. It's probably the largest zoning code amendment that the city of Milwaukee will do. So I want to also say that while it's extremely dramatic, they will be very large. These are cover very large area, but the changes will be very slow because they will be done by individuals on lots at will, bit by bit, and you may not see changes for a very long time. So nothing is going to change overnight. But one of the main goals of addressing this is to to address historic patterns of inequity. Next. There's a book that I recommend people read called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, which is about how American zoning practice, specifically single family zoning, has caused segregation for a long time in our cities. So the changes that we're engaged in this project are focused on that exact aspect, single family zoning. These are large areas that have historically only allowed one kind of housing, detached single dwellings. Many Americans have not ever been able to afford this. Lots of Americans have been kind of shut out of the American dream because they couldn't get loans for this housing. They couldn't live in these zones. And so what single family zoning has actually done is segregated our cities by age, race, income, and household type. And your comprehensive plan goes into detail about exclusion laws dating back to the Oregon State's founding, specifically to McMinnville in the early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s. But nationwide, I want to make the point that even after a lot of civil rights movements had achieved a lot of changes for America overall, through our single family zoning, which we didn't ever change even after the 1968 passage of the Fair Housing laws, has continued to cause segregation in our neighborhoods. And Milwaukee's history is not unique. It's in the very same situation as most other cities right now. But Milwaukee is unique for setting a vision for how to change that. In your comprehensive plan, you have create a more welcoming and diverse community, along with many other policies about natural resources and increasing your climate resiliency. Next. And I want to point out that the reason we have tree experts and parking experts, and this is a very big and complicated project, is because you can't really address single family zoning and change it unless you also address all those other pieces of the puzzle. And in fact, your comprehensive plan asks us to do that. We're also, through this project, addressing a housing crisis. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. Because of major generational and demographic shifts, housing supply and demand is really out of whack right now. And for instance, national shifts that have caused a lot of housing shortage include the Great Recession, where housing wasn't built for a few years, several years, causing a major shortfall. New households are forming, as they would, because people are aging and growing up and forming households and wanting to buy or rent a home. Older people want to downsize and leave their homes and move into a different kind of housing. And then in Milwaukee alone, there's the Max Orange Line and increasing population that have caused a pressure on housing. So all of these combining locally and nationally have caused a housing crisis, and the supply of housing is not keeping up with demand, and the need for affordable housing has basically reached a state of emergency. Next. In 2015, Milwaukee declared a state of housing emergency, and it was ahead of other cities in doing that. And you have made numerous incremental amendments and partially addressed issues of housing choice and affordability. But this project is asking us, and many citizens have asked us, to look bigger, think bigger, and be bolder. And that's why we're undertaking this project right now. And this is an opportunity for us to really rethink the single family neighborhood, and in the process rethink the role of parking and how to codify in your zoning code the contribution that trees make to your city. Next. Along with all of this is the House Bill 2001, which Oregon legislature passed for middle housing. And I'm just including this. I'm not going to talk about it in much detail. We've talked about it in past presentations that I think are available. But the House Bill 2001 requires cities to allow in single family zones duplexes on every lot. And then it also requires them to allow in areas other types of housing, including triplexes, quadplexes, row houses, and cottage clusters. Next. And I think it's good when we talk about changing single family housing and zones to talk about the people rather than what people tend to revert to first is the zoning or the density or the degree of change, but because we're really talking about different households that aren't properly accommodated now by the housing that's being created. And part of the reason the housing is so monoculture is because other types of housing are not permitted. But it's also because there are things like parking requirements that make it difficult to build other types of housing or make the housing that does get built unaffordable. So we're talking, I did a longer presentation of these different kind of profiles in another presentation, and I hope if you're interested, you'll either ask Vera for that or, but it's good to think about people who may, like profiled on the upper part of the slide, who may want to have a small house, not a detached house necessarily with a whole yard, but they'd like to have maybe a front door and a back door because they have a pet. They'd like to go in and out. They'd like it to be affordable, maybe something for this time in their lives. Maybe there's a multi-generational family that's certainly not being the typical detached single dwelling is not appropriate for a multi-generational family. And I think this multi-generational need, a lot of people are feeling that right now because of COVID. We're living with family members or in ways that we've never done before, and we don't have the housing necessarily that supports that. Next, just wanted to profile a couple of other samples. Someone who wants to live in a more urban area, or maybe in a more urban style of housing closer to transit, doesn't want actually to live in a single detached dwelling. There are young people who want to are trying to get a home to live in on their own for the first time and can't afford the single family neighborhood, but they'd like to live in a place that feels like a single family neighborhood. And then there's the profiled woman below and her child. A lot of these households, you may know that since the 1950s, houses sizes have increased by 2.5 times, but households have actually been shrinking. And home builders really aren't building to or aren't able to build to that smaller household. And many of these smaller households are single parent families, and a majority of single parent families are parented by moms. And these people are often kind of pushed to a apartment district, not near schools or parks. And they would like to, people like this would like to have the choice to live in a neighborhood near schools and parks within walking distance of services. So what the middle housing bill does and what comprehensive plan for your city has asked you to do is update your zoning code so that it can accommodate the wider variety of households and people that want to live in your neighborhoods. Next. So now I'm going to just get into some of the nitty-gritty about the code. What does the comprehensive plan say specifically we need to change about your code? So we divided up the main threads of the comprehensive plan into 3 mandates. One is increase the supply of middle or attainable housing and provide equitable access and housing choice for all. The other is increase the tree canopy and preserve existing trees. And the third thread or theme or mandate really is manage parking to enable middle housing and protect trees. Then we went through, we used these mandates as our filter for all of the code amendments that we had identified need to be made. And I'm going to go through this pretty quickly so that we can get onto the exercise. But in the area of housing, some of our recommendations are that more forms of housing need to be permitted in low and medium density zones. You have some zones that allow some of the housing types that I talked about, but they're very, very limited in their area. And another one is to remove codes and procedures that are barriers to reducing the cost of development. One of the mandates that comes out of House Bill 2001 is to not penalize, do not discriminate against middle housing, do not apply rules that are more strict or more difficult to meet than those that are required for a single family house, for example. So the height can't be less than the height for a single family house, and the setbacks can't be more than the setbacks for a single family house. And this is very fitting because most of these middle housing types fit, they look like a single family house, or they fit into the neighborhood in terms of their form and scale. Next. So as I mentioned, House Bill 2001 requires duplexes in all residential zones on all lots, and then these other middle housing types in areas. And that is part of our question as we go forward to the code concepts phase is in what areas, in what form. So I'm going to skip through this pretty quickly. The next piece I want to talk about is how we have to change your code so that it meets your comprehensive plan goals for trees. it's clear to us consultants looking at your city and touring it and reading all the literature that trees are a Milwaukee key to Milwaukee's quality of life. They are so dominant in everywhere you go. And of course, they're an asset to your climate's resiliency goals. You have a target to reach a 40% tree canopy, and a lot of that will have to be done or is already being met on private property. But as we start to introduce some of these housing types and also start to look at the challenges of parking, those trees are somewhat endangered. So we need to look at how we can balance all of these goals together. Next.
Hey, Marcy, we have about 10 minutes before we need to start the exercise. So just a heads up.
Yeah, I'm actually getting down to the end here. So there is a lack right now of code that applies to trees on private property. So that's one of our jobs, is to write the regulations that would apply to trees on private property. And we're going to talk to you a little bit about how you do that and actually get your help thinking that through. I think the next slides are about, there's two that are about parking. So one of the areas that we've identified you need to change in your code is there's actually a requirement that you provide 2 spaces for some of these middle housing types. And that is a cost burden for middle housing, but obviously it's a challenge to meet, to provide parking. And there's also no way to use on-street parking at the moment. So that will be one of the specific things that we're looking at to change. Next. Yeah, it's kind of covered on this slide. On-street parking cannot be used to meet the parking demand for new middle housing today. So we'll want to look at that, but we'll also want to manage how it's done. And that's partly why we're having our parking expert do parking supply and utilization studies in 4 neighborhoods. Next. Okay, so now I want to get into the exercise and prepare you for what's coming next, which is you're going to help us consider some of the types of standards that we have to write for your code. A clear and objective standard is what we're trying to define for you, so you have a picture of where we're going. A clear and objective standard is something that you'll find in the zoning code that says your setback has to be 5 feet or 10 feet or 15 feet, depending. It's a number, it's a dimensional standard, and the answer to that question is yes or no. It doesn't take a design review board to tell you that you've met that. And so we're trying to get as much of your code to be clear and objective as possible. In fact, we're required to, for middle housing specifically, by House Bill 2001. There can't be any discretionary or judgment-based rules for housing. So we're going to walk you through what a clear and objective standard looks like, and then we're going to show you some examples specifically for housing, trees, and parking, and then we're going to explain the exercise to you. So here's an example of a clear and objective standard for common open space that exists in your code today. It has numbers in it for buildings with more than 5 dwelling units, a minimum of 10% of the gross site area, or 750 square feet, whichever is greater, shall be designated as common open space. And I won't go through the whole thing. You can scan that quickly on your own. But this is an example of a clear and objective standard that covers a lot of different aspects and is somewhat complicated, but it's still clear and objective. Next. So I want to talk a little bit about this thing called the form-based code, which we're going to be moving into a little bit more as we write clear and objective standards for the form of housing and for the placement of trees and for the location of parking. A form-based code is one that's not so much concerned with the land use of the building, but it's concerned, or the use inside the building, it's more concerned with the form of the building. And the middle housing, the way that form-based codes apply to middle housing is middle housing should look like the housing that's in the neighborhood. Most middle housing, whether it's a duplex or a triplex, should look like the housing in the neighborhood. And that is how most middle housing actually looks. There may be 2 units inside this house-shaped form, but it's still a house-shaped form. It still has trees around it. It still has open space around it. There are some of these middle housing types, such as the townhouses that will be attached, and there may be some of these cottages that may be attached, but those would be more context appropriate responses. Next. So some of the benefits of form-based codes are, or maybe I should start with that there are basically 2 components, a regulating plan or a zoning map. They're often very similar or the same. And the development standards, which it usually is represented in a table, so it's easier to read, although then there have to be more detailed standards written out, as you saw in the common open space example. But they're clear and objective dimensional standards that regulate the shape, size, and location of structures and other items on a site. Now, what can be a benefit about form-based codes is that they're a little easier for people to understand. I'm hoping that you might feel that way after you get done with our interactive exercise. There are a lot more visuals, graphics, and tables to help you understand the effect of the dimensional standards. They can be easier to administer. They're usually more clear about what the goal is in terms of the form of the development. And so they can help people visualize what is expected more quickly. Next. Okay, so now I'm going to explain the exercises for you. We're going to be dividing up into breakout groups, and you're going to help us consider these one at a time. Clear and objective standard for housing, and then for trees, and then for parking. So here's an example that we'll have available to you in the breakout. Clear and objective standard for housing. This is in your code today. It makes the garage can be no more than 40% of the facade width. So the goal of this standard is to make to have housing that faces the street that's not dominated by a garage, or the garage is not set way forward from the house so that it might dominate the streetscape. Your facilitator will go into this in more detail. Let me show you the example of a tree. Now, you don't have clear and objective standards for trees, but on the left, I'm showing you an example that cities commonly have. Often a tree is measured from the DBH, or diameter breast height, which this diagram shows. At the height of a human chest, there's a dimension that's taken around the trunk of the tree. And if it's over a certain size, it's usually eligible for preservation. Now, your facilitator will go through this in more detail, but I've included here some examples that are sort of typical tree preservation standards. And the general philosophy is, if a tree is a certain size, it needs to be preserved. If it can't be, you either have to replace it with other trees on the same site, or you pay in lieu fee. Now, these are not, this has not been adopted for Milwaukee. These are things that we'll be discussing, but this is how other cities have regulated trees. And then on the right is a provision from your own code about parking. That's quite clear. It has a diagram, pretty easy to understand, about specifically on a single family lot or single dwelling zone lot, where parking is allowed to be on the lot behind a certain setback line and in relationship to the footprint of the house. So those are 3 examples of clear and objective standards to keep in mind. I'm going to give you one more little preview of the interactive exercise. So to help you understand how these 3 things fit together, housing, trees, and parking, we've created a little scenario. And we're asking you to imagine that you're looking in plan at a single family lot that has a house on it. And it has an orange space for a driveway, and it has a green tree. And then in the event that you create a duplex, there are 3 different ways you might create a duplex on the site. You could add it to the existing dwelling through an internal conversion. You could add it through new construction, or you could add just a new structure. And so what we've shown here is to help illustrate the trade-offs is better shown on the next page. Quickly, I'll just go through these so you have a preview. 3 different scenarios. The first one is we say we add a structure that's low in profile and attached to the original structure. The building footprint then expands to about 1.5 times its original size. The additional parking space that would be required is accommodated on the street rather than on the lot, and that large tree on the site can remain. In scenario 2, we do the same thing, but we must provide the parking space on the site. And so the driveway is extended and the tree is replaced with smaller trees. And in the last scenario, we actually pop up the building so that it's approximately the same footprint, but it's now 2 to 2.5 times its size and height. And we use the on-street parking, and we save the tree. And in this case, just want to point out that this one it's a compromise of all of those other factors, but it allows more pervious surface to remain. So that's the exercise. I'm going to hand it over to Kimmy now to set us up for that.
Great. Okay. So now we are going to be divided into breakout rooms, and Mary will do that automatically for us. She'll just put you in a group. And then we'll have a small group discussions where we will go through these examples in a little more detail and ask for your feedback on development standards you think should apply to housing, trees, and parking, and how we can use clear and objective language to do that. So thinking about the yes or no answer concept. And then we'll look at this example, this last example Marcy went through about comparing them and then the trade-offs that we have to take. We'll do that for about 30 minutes, and then we will come back and have each group report out, probably about a 3-minute quick report out. And we're going to ask one of the members of the committee here to do that report out. So be thinking about that as you're in your small groups. And then we'll just do a few-minute wrap up and public Q&A at the end. So as far as the groups go, Mary's already got them assigned, and we'll put everybody in a group automatically. Public will all be in a group as well. So we'd like to hear your feedback, and we will just think we can go ahead and do that. And facilitators and scribes have all been assigned, and someone will be taking notes for each group as we go along.
On this question 1, maybe one new point or thought was just about some interest in allowing a kind of like a height increase if the new project chose not to provide on-site parking. And we didn't really have a chance to discuss these, but shall I just kind of put that out there and then move on to the next question? Is that what you'd like? Yes. Okay. Yes. I will do that. Okay. Question 2. Let's see. In general, I think there was a sense that it was pretty important to set the priority at preserving existing trees, particularly existing mature trees, and to kind of work around them with some flexibility. I think, adjusting setbacks and kind of recognizing that they're important. They're an important piece of infrastructure, and we need to try to be flexible. So putting a lot of priority on the tree preservation. The third question, I think in general, this idea of again providing the flexibility that's needed to kind of try to preserve trees and neighborhood character, especially over something like parking, seemed to be the group idea. And then with respect to the scenarios, again, I think the theme that I got was the importance of, again, tree preservation and allowing allowing some diversity of, building form within our neighborhoods, and kind of, again, choosing to prioritize tree protection and allowing a variety of different design types in a neighborhood. So I don't know if anybody in our group, or Laura, if you want to qualify or add anything.
Well, I just think that, I can just say that height didn't seem to be a concern. Again, it was going back to that allowing all different kinds of forms so that the trees could be preserved, and that the mature tree canopy is the most important thing here, not just the number of trees on the site. But then in some places there needs to be the option for the fee in lieu of, because there's some lots that are just smaller and won't be able to accommodate the site and put extra development on the site. And I would just ask if anybody else from our group would like to add two lines before we hand it over to the next group. Hearing no one, I will hand it over.
Great. Group 2, which is Peter's group.
So Kimmy, I'm gonna share my notes. We actually were without Peter, but we forged ahead. We had a lot to discuss. So Tracy from our group is going to talk, but I'm just gonna share my notes so she has those for reference.
Thank you.
Get them. Okay, here they are, Tracy.
All right. Oh. Gosh. Oh, there we go. Okay, I see. Okay, so I think for the middle housing, we just kind of brainstormed some different quantifiable parameters that one could use, such as lot width and depth, height, step backs, which kind of tie into privacy, density, like how many units you can actually physically fit on a lot, and parking requirements. I think common space, we talked about that a decent amount, kind of what constitutes a comfortable open space versus, something like a Juliet balcony, which allows you to open up something, but you don't get to step out on it and be on it as an outdoor space. And kind of figuring out what those minimum dimensions would be for a comfortable outdoor space. For trees, I think we talked about the importance of the size of the tree and maintaining the canopy. And but it's a challenge to define exactly what size is most appropriate. We had some talk about maintaining heritage trees, certain varieties that are endangered, while also being mindful of climate change and the effect that might have on certain species of trees. Not all of them can handle our changing climate as well, so being aware of that. And just thinking about what types of replacement trees you would propose, what the limits are for that if you had to take trees out. And some of that ties into trade-offs. We did not get into parking specifically, but I'll just dive into the trade-offs because we talked about it a little bit there. Talked a lot about how every street is really different and context is really important with some of these trade-offs. One of those options might be totally acceptable in one neighborhood and would completely not work in another. So we also talked about how you quantify tree replacement if you do an inch for inch replacement, and how, depending on how that site is set up and how big the building is, how much outdoor space you're left with, doing an inch for inch trade-off may not physically work within that space. You don't want to plant trees that won't necessarily fit once they reach maturity. Let's see. We talked about the possibility of asking applicants for building projects to work with an arborist as part of a pre-application process, just to get a sense of context of the site and see what would work versus what might not. Did I miss anything, Pauline?
That sounds great. I'll see if anyone in our group wants to speak up with any additions.
Sounds good.
Great. I'll hand it back.
So group 3 is Marcy's group.
And I nominated Renee. She agreed to be our spokesperson.
All right, so I'm just going to go off the notes here, basically, and we spent a little bit of time trying to figure out how we could both best focus our information here. So that took up some time. I don't even think we got to question 4, but so some of the issues for the housing was a percentage of the lot that was being taken up by the buildings, and then also how big the lots, I guess, had to be. Some common things like the setbacks, what would be required, and then hand in hand with that, the amount of space that would not be the building, but would be some kind of vegetated area, whether it was plantings or trees. And then the concern with how you choose where to put the housing across, globally. So the next 2 bullets could potentially be conflicting goals here. So one was to spread out the new density that comes with housing equitably throughout the area, and the other one was to center it around public transportation or corridors or hubs. And then there was a really very helpful suggestion, I think, that if we had some case studies of how our codes currently would be applied to new middle housing, it would be helpful to know what needs to be addressed, because maybe there's not so many problems. And then the last thing was the need to consider the existing utilities when adding in additional housing within the same space. Okay, then moving on to trees, which is interesting. Some of these things we talked about came up in the last group's question 4, I think. So we had several people from the tree board, and we got a little bit of an overview of what they've been discussing and the complexity of it. So I think there's a lot of things that we didn't really get down on paper here, but the biggest thing was that there should be some way of regulating tree removal on private property, and something addressing how to assure that maintenance was happening, allowing people potentially assistance with that. And then we weren't really supposed to talk about street trees, but there's an issue with homeowners or property owners having to maintain those as well. So let's see, then.
How about we go on to parking?
Okay.
Thanks.
Sure.
Or the last, whatever, yeah.
All right, so the parking, we had everything from public education to reduce use of cars, and to setting up specific areas within a neighborhood that would be a parking zone, to accommodating the fact that there are different types of needs in different neighborhoods. That's already been mentioned for parking.
And then did you guys talk about trade-offs, or did you?
I don't, we didn't.
No, we spent all of our time on these 3 topics, and
these are big topics, and we could have spent the entire an hour each on each of these topics easily. So let's go ahead and move to group 4, which was my group. So Joseph.
I volunteered to report back, and most of our topics have already been covered by the other groups, so I'll keep this pretty quick. We did talk about the lot coverage, site coverage, standards for housing, and trying to make sure that there's enough area for vegetation and for healthy trees. We also mentioned the dwelling units size. Maybe as you do more intense developments like a triplex or a quadplex, that the size per unit, you know, becomes a little bit smaller. So you're able to try to keep those affordable and offer more affordable units when you're delivering more units on a site. We also had the kind of district parking and you know, a mention of sidewalks. As we get into the tree, the tree notes, one of the comments was, you know, because of the health benefits of trees, that we probably shouldn't have any exceptions for trees on private property, you know, or tree replacement on private property when even if there is an affordable housing component, because they do offer such a benefit. And so that's part of equitably distributing the tree canopy through the city. We definitely wanted to have, you know, our tree board members offered some, you know, specific suggestions for, you know, how we can make sure that there's, you know, tree biodiversity as well as adequate room and soil and, you know, other resources for trees to be healthy and to, you know, grow, you know, throughout their life cycles. Including, you know, the kinds of impacts that actually could be, you know, allowed a little bit within a clear and objective measurement versus those that would require some kind of mitigation. Another thing that came up that addresses other policy goals, including a connected habitat, is, you know, do the trees on the site provide, do they contribute to that connected habitat network? And that system that you know, that we're looking to preserve and grow, and those kinds of trees might be a higher priority than other trees on the site. And I already mentioned biodiversity to ensure resilience against disease and climate change.
We've got about 30
when it comes
more
to parking,
yeah.
Okay, when it comes to the parking, you know, it is an area problem. There's a lot of people or a lot of areas where it's parking on the street is de facto private parking for the house it's in front of, and we need a little bit more formality, I think, there in terms of what street parking is really available and when if it's not provided on site. Maybe there should be a standard for a maximum parking area. The alleyways was brought up, but we don't have any, but it'd be nice to have standards for those. So we get into the last question, measuring trade-offs. We really understood that kind of all of the trade-off scenarios need to be accommodated under different scenarios and different unique site constraints. So we need the clear and objective standards to provide the guidance towards the scenarios that would then satisfy the most policy objectives given the unique constraints of each site. And I think that covers the most important parts of our notes.
I think it does. Thank you. Group 5, which is Vera and the.
Yeah, so I voluntold Lisa Gunyon-Rinker to be our spokesperson, and she graciously agreed. And Natalie is sharing her screen. So Lisa, take it away.
Hi. Yeah, so our group sounds like they had similar conversations to all the other groups, which means we all have the same mindset, which is good that we're all thinking about these things. And I think the most discussion we did have was also, again, about trees preservation. But we were really looking at duplexes not being as much of an issue as the triplex or quadplexes. And again, we also came down to thinking about affordability and also came up with the idea of the size, limiting the size of the triplexes and the quadplexes units so that we could save some of the pervious area and trees around the area on these sites, which will also help with our stormwater, which will help with our trees, which will help with everything. Parking, we didn't really discuss parking as much at the end of our conversation. I'm just gonna, sorry, skipping to that. I'm just kind of going back through memory of what we just talked about. But the parking, people did not like the parking on the streets that do not have sidewalks currently. And then there was then discussion about our sidewalks and if our sidewalks should actually be made of concrete or if they should be made of some other material. And then there was also then discussion going back. The other thing I can think of that we talked about besides saving our mature trees and also leading to equity throughout the neighborhoods was about from a historic home perspective or a neighborhood perspective of homes in those neighborhoods, about potentially having new development mimic or mirror surrounding neighborhoods from a form and function kind of attitude as well. And we also, there was a question about if parking should be required for individual units. So I think overall, we had a lot of the same thoughts that all the other groups did. I don't have that came up with anything more novel than anybody else. The big thing was keeping our mature canopy. And also if we can, if those trees are on private property, make them part of our stormwater system if they're in people's front yards or near the front area, and also have large mature trees that would shade the streets as well, and maybe have sidewalk bump outs and sidewalks again out of more impervious material, all these different things.
Great, thank you. Those were great. Sounds like some really good discussions, and the fact that we didn't get through it all shows that people had a lot to share, which is great. And I wish we'd had more time. But maybe when we extend our meetings to 3 hours, we'll get a little more time to have these discussions. It sounded like there was a lot of discussion about the ability, for, especially with the trade-offs, to be able to accommodate the different, prioritize different things under different scenarios and in different parts of town given different conditions. So that's a use. All of this is really useful, but that definitely provides some help with what the trade-offs are. We've got 5 minutes to get you all out of here on time, and 2 things to do on the agenda next. We've got the next steps and then time for a few minutes of public comment. So Vera, do you want to do the next steps and we can do public comment?
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to thank everyone for coming tonight. I really appreciate it. This was a great opportunity to hear from everybody. Next steps is pulling all of this information together. I do want to reach out to everyone and have you, reach out to me directly if you have additional comments, questions about anything that we've talked about tonight or what was in the packet. I'm happy to work with you or set up time, to have a conversation about that. So thanks. Thanks very much, but I'm happy to do that for you anytime. Next steps, we've got a little bit of a break before our next meeting while we put all of this stuff together and start thinking about how we're going to initiate this code concepts discussion with the larger city, with the bigger groups, with folks. So we'll be putting that together with the consulting team. Meanwhile, I'll be presenting information to keep the Planning Commission and the City Council caught up and up to speed on everything, and see if they have any additional feedback as we move the project forward. I do, if it's okay, I'm hoping that we can leave this meeting with the CPIC members specifically saying it's okay to have some more time at our next meetings, even if we don't use it all. Is that all right? I'm seeing a lot of thumbs up, so I really appreciate that. Thanks. We don't meet a lot, but when we do meet, they're pretty intense. So if that's okay, we'll extend the time for our next meetings, and we'll go from there. But I think that's all I had for our next steps. I mean, we've got a lot of internal back of the house stuff is going to be happening over the next couple of months before our next meeting, and putting some stuff together for our next public event. We are also meeting with our equity manager in January, kind of following back up on what Kimmy was talking about, to make sure that our follow-up and our subsequent public outreach and our additional outreach opportunities with the city are hitting all of the different communities and the different folks that we need to do that. So we're taking our lessons from that survey and from the Engagement Milwaukee website, and we're really learning from that, and we want to expand what we're doing. So we'll definitely be making improvements and expanding that information as well. So I think that's all I had for next steps. Did I miss anything? Anyone? Okay.
And then we do have, at the end of the agenda, we had time for public comment, public questions. Public participated throughout the exercise. I don't know if you have anything else that you want to add, or are we good for this meeting? Elvis, you had something?
I had submitted 3 pages of comments, and I don't think I've changed my opinions at all to the group. And I guess the biggest thing was that, in my mind, the parking issue is the biggest trade-off, and it really depends on each street, and each situation is fairly unique, and that lends itself more to a discretionary review for the parking component as you add new housing units into a street. And I don't think you can fix it with a one-time survey, because streets and conditions evolve over time, and as you add more units, maybe a low volume street becomes a heavier volume street. And so that's my biggest point, that my biggest concern is too much parking on the street reliance. Thank you.
Thanks, Elvis. There's anything else? We're right on time, 8 o'clock. So again, all my contact information was in the email that I sent out to everybody. So if you need to reach out and have any questions, please do so. It's not really the kind of meeting where you make a motion, but I make a motion that everyone have a wonderful holiday and a very happy and healthy new year. Do I hear a second?
I second, Vera.
Thank you.
You.
Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate your time tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Stay healthy,
Thank
everyone.
you.